U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's latest Israel trip turned out to be a half deal. Israel okaying a plan to break the ceasefire impasse, but Hamas criticizing such a plan. Now, what lies ahead for the Middle East now? For more, let's turn to Professor Robert Lawrence this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So what happened is that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreeing to the U.S.'s new bridging proposal, which reports say is a first time for Netanyahu. How much progress is this?
Well, it is significant progress in that it gets Israel to the table, right? So this proposal endorsed by Egypt and Qatar was meant to bridge the gap between the positions of Israel and Hamas to secure a ceasefire. However, it isn't perfect, and Hamas is arguing that the proposal has a pro-Israel bias. It's saying that it deviated from previously agreed upon terms, and it gave in to too many Israeli demands. So hope of a ceasefire is preventing escalation by other regional actors, but it's really going to depend on if Qatar, Egypt, the U.S., and other international actors will be able to convince Hamas to buy in, despite this not being exactly what they want. So there's progress, yes, but there's a lot of work to do over the next few days in Cairo.
To add more, Netanyahu is reportedly being two-faced in that although he's agreed to the proposal, he knows Hamas apparently won't accept the idea. Now, is Netanyahu being political here? What's his deal?
Well, Netanyahu is in a pretty difficult political position right now, from all sides, to be honest. The U.S. has increased its pressure on Israel to make a deal because the U.S. doesn't want to see an escalation into a greater regional conflict, and it believes the ceasefire with Hamas will be the crucial card that can prevent that from happening. Additionally, there are U.S. electoral politics that are playing a crucial role here. Kamala Harris has made this a major talking point along the campaign trail. So domestically in Israel, he's facing a great deal of pressure from domestic rivals concerning his judicial reforms, the ongoing corruption trial, the security failure that allowed October 7th to happen. And I would argue, more importantly, the perception that he's refusing to make the hostages the top priority. This has led a lot of people in Israel to accuse him of prolonging the war to stay in power to avoid these inquiries and trials. So even on top of that, on top of his domestic foes, inside of his ruling coalition, the far-right members are also threatening to dissolve government if he's too lenient in the negotiations with Hamas. So Netanyahu is pretty busy trying to keep his head above water and keep the government intact.
Well, Hamas is clearly not too fond of this ceasefire deal, saying they don't need new Gaza ceasefire negotiations. Instead, they're requesting that they need to agree on an implementation mechanism. Now, what do they mean by this implementation mechanism?
Well, Hamas doesn't believe that any variation from the previously agreed upon arrangement is necessary. They want to implement what was already agreed upon. So in May 31st, President Joe Biden laid this some principles out in a White House speech, and Israel agreed to these principles. This was the basis for a United Nations Security Council resolution, which then turned into a proposal made by mediators, and Hamas agreed to that on July 2nd. So Hamas doesn't want to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. They want to implement what they've already negotiated. However, since then, Israel has changed its demands on a few crucial subjects that are unacceptable to Hamas, and Israel isn't willing to budge on. So this is where we run into a problem with the current situation. Hamas doesn't want to implement, or Hamas doesn't want to renegotiate. They want to implement the previous arrangement. Therefore, they don't really see much efficacy or any need for a bridging proposal.
Well, that leads to my next question. What deals will eventually satisfy Hamas then? What do you think, Professor Lawrence?
Well, Hamas wants a prisoner exchange, reconstruction arrangements, a permanent ceasefire, and all Israeli troops out of Gaza. Now, just to be more specific on the last two, Hamas does not want a temporary ceasefire that could end as soon as Israel gets back its hostages. Moreover, Hamas doesn't accept any Israeli troops hanging behind to maintain control of the Philadelphia and Netzarim corridors. So these two corridors are very important. The Philadelphia corridor is a 14-kilometer corridor on the Gazan side of the Egyptian border, under which Israel has found dozens of tunnels. Now, Israel is maintaining that it wants to keep control of this so that munitions can't be smuggled underneath the border and Hamas won't be able to rearm itself, right? The Netzarim corridor is a little bit different. It divides the Gaza Strip between north and south. And Hamas wants the people who are misplaced because of the fighting, because of the war, to be able to freely go back north to their homes. Israel doesn't see it this way. Israel wants to have checkpoints up to be able to make sure that there are no armed Hamas fighters going north, thus threatening Israel further. So those are the four main demands that Hamas has. But you run into some serious roadblocks with the last two.
Well, regardless of all these complex situations, Israel is still sending its negotiating team to Egypt this week for a fresh round of Gaza ceasefire and, like you said, hostage release talks. How meaningful would this trip be if Hamas is not going to be there?
Well, it's tough to say. I would say Hamas is likely going to have a presence at the negotiations. It may not be directly, sitting at the table directly across from its Israeli counterparts, but just like in Doha, they're going to have people nearby the negotiations that are able to take part on some level. With Qatar and Egypt's support for this proposal and all the other international support, I think the opportunity cost and the increased threat of a wider regional conflict implicit in a failure in these negotiations, it makes it very risky to let all of this effort go to waste, because there's no real guarantee that this will be repeated. So we'll have to see how the next few days go, but I think it could be extremely dangerous if these efforts dissolve into nothing. There's still, plenty of possibility to take meaningful steps in negotiations over the next few days if all parties engage.
All righty, Professor Lawrence, thank you so much for your insight and your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.
You too.